If you like what you're hearing, you can support me on Patreon, patreon.com/mtgbooks, or look me up, Phil Dawson. Thank you. Chapter 15. Pawn. Urza awoke slowly. The room was pitch black, and so hot that sweat from his brow had pooled on the tabletop, batting together several old manuscripts. There was a vile taste in his mouth. Coughing, he sat up and realized he'd chewed on a scroll in his sleep. That explained the awful flavor of ink. He thought the lamp into working, flashed to life, first red, then orange, gradually brightening to a soft yellow glow. He had no idea what time it was or how long he'd been in the dusty, arid annex. Trampling through piles of open scrolls, he reached the door and threw back the bolt. Air poured in like a cool waterfall. He held out his arms and drank it in gratefully. The Citadel rooms were all but airtight with their doors closed. It was a wonder he hadn't suffocated in this book-lined tomb. Sweaty and with sleep-swollen features, Urza sauntered down the corridor. From the amount of light coming from outside, it seemed like late morning or early afternoon. Rath had no proper day or night, but diurnal variations of the great energy beam approximated 2 halves of a day. He wanted a cool drink, some decent food, and a bath. Thoughts of bathing made him smile. He'd use the fancy tub at the Evankar's quarters again. Maybe this time Belby would join him. It'd be a good place to spring his plan about the 2 of them, leaving Rath forever. The side hall connected to a major corridor that was surprisingly full of people. The Citadel hadn't been this lively since he'd arrived. Now the place bustled with servants and elaborately dressed courtiers, some hastening from point to point, others lingering in handy alcoves, conversing in loud theatrical whispers. "Pardon me, but what's the stir?" he asked a trio of gaudy loafers. "Have you not heard? We've captured Eladamri." The fat courtier, who bowed under a headdress loaded with gems, didn't look like he'd ever captured anything but a free meal. "Are you certain? When did this happen?" "I saw him myself in the convocation hall not a half hour ago," said the fellow haughtily. "He's a savage, no doubt about it. Tried to kill the emissary in front of the whole court." He tugged on the courtier's copious sleeve. "Is Belby all right?" Lord Widewaist removed his gold-embroidered sleeve from Urza's ink-stained fingers. "No harm came to Her Excellency," he sniffed. Urza made a slight alteration to the flowstone around the courtier's feet, uttered a brief thanks, and hurried on. A few moments later, he was rewarded by the sound of the bloated courtier falling flat on his face. Urza had locked his slippers to the floor. The hall leading in the convocation antechamber widened. Urza broke into a trot. He dodged around slow-moving loiterers, then bumped into the broad back of a man who wasn't moving at all. "Out of the way," he said. "This is a public hall, not a public house." The big man turned around. "I know you," Urza said. "You're a soldier, Sergeant somebody or other." "Nasser's my name." Another sinewy fellow moved in behind Urza. "This is Sergeant Valmerol." The sweat turned cold on Urza's neck. "How do you do?" They're both in cloth jerkins and trews, so he said, "Is this your day off, boys?" "Sergeant's work is never done," Nasser replied. The one called Valmoral poked the tip of a short but very sharp knife into the small of Urza's back. We know you're a tricky fellow, so choose your next act carefully. You have my full attention. You'll come with us, Valmoral said. You really think you can abduct me here in front of all these people? You'll come, said Nasser. The life of the emissary's at stake. Belby? Urtai's eyes narrowed. He could, with a little effort, send simultaneous psychokinetic bursts from each hand and repel the two roughnecks. But then what? For all he knew, Belby was already in their hands. He relaxed, letting his shoulders sag. Good thinking, Nasser said. This way. They moved slowly against the general flow of the crowd. The soldiers stood on either side, steering him with nudges from their broad shoulders. He thought fast and hard. At least tell me where we're going, he said out of the side of his mouth. To a place of calm reflection, Nasser replied. I could use some calm reflection. Ah! Valmoral pricked him with the point of his knife. You chatter like a percher. Be silent. They turned off the main corridor to a small side hall, losing most of the foot traffic as they did. They went on quite a ways and turned off again, this time into a passage just wide enough for two men to walk abreast. Fourth door on the right, Nasser said. He slowed his pace until Valmoral reached out to shove him forward. As soon as Urtai shuffled forward out of arm's reach, he commanded the flowstone walls to narrow. Two bulges formed in front of the sergeants, blocking their way. Urtai ran. Hold, you! He skidded to a stop at the fourth door and glanced back at the trapped men. One was shouting dire threats. The other was trying to worm past the obstruction. Urtai put a hand on the door handle. It swung inward. He looked into the smiling face of Krovax.
Having fun, boy?
He said.
Good. I'm in the mood for some fun, too.
Tainel, Civi, and the rebels cautiously trailed behind Eladamri and his escort of palace guards. It was easy to follow them, even through the crowds, because Grevenil Vec overtopped everyone in sight. As long as they kept their warrior's towering frame in view, they knew where their leader was. Except for Civi's Toten Vec, they were unarmed. Even as Rathi soldiers, they had to surrender their weapons when they entered the palace. Eladamri had been preternaturally calm through all the danger, until he laid eyes on the emissary. His subsequent murderous, implacable rage was something none of them had ever seen in him before. The emissary looks like an elf, Civi noted as they shadowed their captive leader. Is that what angered him? I don't know, said Tainel, but I have a bad feeling about it. I wasn't expecting her. I don't think Eladamri was either. I didn't think they would act so quickly to interrogate him. We can't let them torture him, Civi said. Tainel turned back abruptly, coming nose to nose with Lyn Civi. We have a mission to perform. If you aren't happy with the way I'm leading it, you're free to leave. Her hostile glare softened, so he added, I don't intend to lose Eladamri, but he may have to endure some hardship before we can retrieve him. He understood that before we left Skywishroud. Didn't you? Eladamri and his captors halted near the mouth of a gilded bridge that led out onto the open crater. A short way down, a large conical building extended well below the line of the bridge. They heard Greven speak. Take a last look, he said, his inflection oddly respectful. You may not see daylight again. Eladamri inhaled deeply. I will know the light. Far longer than you, butcher. Any trace of compassion left Greven's voice. Forward, he barked. The guards locked their shields together. Eladamri was now closed inside a living cage. Head held high, he strode in perfect step with the escort. The rebels were pressed into individual niches in the wall just behind the bridge landing. They saw and heard the exchange between Greven and Eladamri. What is this place? Asked Civi. A prison, I assume, Tainel said. It's isolated from the rest of the fortress. How do we get in? We don't. We're following Eladamri's original plan. Civi, you take half the men and look for Predator. I'll lead the rest and search where you don't. Take no action when you do find it. We need to make sure of the one attack we'll get. We'll rendezvous in 4 intervals at the entrance to the big hall we saw. Then we all go back to the airship and finish it once and for all. Civi stepped out of her niche and tapped the shoulders of 4 of the rebels. Wordlessly, they peeled off and followed her. Tainel watched her take her squad up a spiral staircase. Tainel signaled the remaining rebels to follow him. Since Civi chose to go higher in the Citadel, they would search low. She could still feel the pressure of his hand around her throat. What was it that drove this total stranger to attack her in full view of the assembled court? Belby sat sideways in the throne of Rath and tried to answer the question logically. He called her an abomination, a lie. Both implied representations of truth that were actually false. How was she false? She was who she was, made on the fourth sphere of Phyrexia for this exact mission. Did she resemble someone known to Eladamri? She rejected the idea as too absurd. If that was true, who was Avila? Belby shook her head. It throbbed a little where Eladamri had dashed it against the floor. She didn't have enough information to answer her questions. The only place she could get more was from Eladamri. The convocation room was empty. All that remained were the flags, Eladamri's manacles, and Belby. She picked up the heavy chains. By now, the rebel leader was beginning his interrogation. She remembered what Urtai looked like after Greven was done with him. Sour taste spread up her throat. No doubt Eladamri was tougher than Urtai, but the thought of him being burned and beaten by Greven's Mogs made her ill. It was easy enough to send him there when he'd just tried to throttle her. She regretted it now. There'd been enough violence in this place, too much. She was sick of it. If she had authority to stop it, it was high time she exercised it. Belby hurried from the hall, still gripping the manacles. She'd had enough of Krovax's bullying, too. He'd humiliated her in the past, but this last time was in public. She wouldn't stand for it anymore. If Greven would back her up, she was willing to name Urtai as the next Evankar of Rath. Krovax wouldn't take it lying down, but she had a few surprises for him. Among the equipment sent with her from Phyrexia was a case of special weapons. She was supposed to supply these weapons to the new Evankar, but she had a better use for them. Her masters might not approve, but she had already gone too far down the road of resistance to feel faint-hearted. With Urtai at her side, she'd free Greven from his control rod, and together the three of them would destroy Krovax and establish Rath as a sovereign world, no longer the puppet of Phyrexia or a threat to Dominaria. And possibly, if Eladamri were amenable, he could have a post in her new order too. The Flowbot lift carried her swiftly to the Evankar's quarters. When she arrived in the outer chamber, the room was dark. Belby asked for light, but nothing happened. Annoyed, she climbed the stairs and entered the statuary room. There, lamps blazed brightly. She stopped short. Something was amiss. Nothing in the room was disturbed, but she avoided the usual path through the statues, preferring to hug the wall instead. The Phyrexian crates were where she had left them, seals intact. She pressed her thumb into the shallow depression on the back of the seal, and it opened with a click. Nestled in the crate were two identical weapons, plasma energy dischargers. They were shoulder arms, like crossbows, but instead a steel bow at a right angle to the stock. There was a long metal casing ending with two sharp metal points pointing forward. Dischargers used a single power stone. 6 were stored in a crate. These stones were so strongly charged they couldn't be loaded bare-handed. She picked up an L-shaped loading tool, pressed it against one of the power stones, and inserted it into the slot on the underside of the weapon. A row of green and red jewels on top of the discharger began to glow. The weapon was armed. Cradling the Phyrexian weapon under her arm, Belby hurried to the lift. She was halfway across the statuary room when she heard a tinny whistling. Belby swung the discharger around, aiming the double points in the direction of the sound. The little tune repeated. "Come out! I'll use this," she said. The whistler's reply was mockingly the same. Her thumb pressed against a smooth pad on the rear of the metal housing. There was a flash like lightning, an ear-splitting crack, and one of Volrath's statues was blasted in two. The tune ceased.
Our masters make impressive weapons, don't they?
Krovax was close behind her, too close. She tried to bring the heavy discharger to bear, but he tore it from her hands before she could get it leveled. Belby leapt at him, trying to snatch the weapon back. Krovax casually punched her on the jaw. She flew backward against a statue of a crouching youth. By the time Belby shook off the blow, the tips of the discharger were an inch from her face.
You have an extraordinarily hard head, but I suspect this device can deal with that,
said Krovax. "At this range, you'll vaporize my skull," Belby said.
Really?
Krovax caressed the weapon admiringly. Belby waited for the flash and the oblivion to follow. Krovax raised the tips to the ceiling.
Get up!
He went to the door. Men filed in from the darkened staircase. She recognized them as the corps of sergeants. Two of them bore a third man between them, hands tied and mouth gagged. Urtai. Their eyes met. Belby made a half step in his direction but froze when Sergeant Valmorel pressed the edge of his knife into Urtai's jugular. She forced herself to be calm. Now what?
This is a coup.
Krovax replied matter-of-factly.
As of this moment, I'm taking over the rule of Rath. You will name me Evan Carr in front of these witnesses now.
And if I don't?
Sergeant Valmorel will bleed the boy dry.
Belby folded her arms. So do it. I'll not be coerced. Korvax shrugged and nodded. Valmorel drew his knife back to add force to the cut. Urtai's eyes widened, then he squeezed them shut. Down came the stroke of the blade. Under her arm, Belby had secreted a broken piece of the statue she'd fallen against. It was the young man's hand, a slender, elegant hand, fingers gathered in, touching the finely carved thumb. Made of flowstone, it weighed about a pound. She whipped this at Valmorel with all the speed and power she possessed. It hit him in the forehead just before the stroke of the knife laid open Urtai's throat. The room erupted. Urtai swung his bound hands at the nearest man, catching him in the gut. Belby whirled and sprang at Krovax. He pointed the Phyrexian weapon at her, but nothing happened. Alarmed, he dropped it, and the flowstone statue of an Adronologist nude between them and Belby came to life at his command. Belby tried to dodge it, but the statue caught her around the waist and flung her back. Two sergeants moved in. They wore helmets and breastplates, but were only armed with knives. Belby got a foot against the moving statue and heaved it away. The first man slashed at her. She caught his arm and broke it like a twig. He howled and dropped his blade. She twisted his arm behind him, spinning him around, and shoved him against his oncoming comrades. The floor crept up around her ankles and hardened. Belby dodged one soldier, knelt, and hammered the flowstone with her fists. The material around her right foot splintered, freeing it. She promptly used it to kick one of her attackers in the chest. His cuirass indented 3 inches from the blow. She felt the ribs behind the armor crack, and the man went down. A knife point raked across the bridge of her nose. This one was going for her eyes. Enraged, Belby brought her hand across to ward off another attack. The sergeant drove his knife right through the palm of her hand. She blocked the pain and closed her fingers around the knife, crushing every bone in his hand. He groaned, fell to his knees. Belby slid her impaled hand off the knife blade and delivered a reverse kick to the back of the man's skull. There was a crunch of bone, and he pitched forward. The man was dead before his head hit the floor. All of a sudden, the fight was over. Belby had disposed of 4 attackers. Her left foot was trapped in a thick block of flowstone, and glistening oil was leaking from a hole in her hand. Krovax and the rest of the sergeants withdrew beyond her reach. Urtai, arms and legs stretched wide, was being held by 2 of Volrath's statues, animated for the task by Krovax. His shirt was torn open, and a bright red slash crossed his chest. Valmorel, an ugly gash on his head, had cut Urtai once and was poised to do so again.
Finish him!
Krovax ordered. No, said Belby. Don't hurt him!
You see?
Krovax said to his surviving men.
Love conquers all.
2 statues seized Belby by the hands and feet, spread-eagling her off the floor like Urtai. Krovax found the discharger, picked his way over the fallen men and toppled statues to Belby.
You're quite formidable. The overlords built you well,
he said. I'll be sure to relay your compliments, she replied, panting. He held up the discharger.
Why wouldn't this work for me?
The mechanism is protected. It will function only if I use it, she lied. Krovax tossed the exotic weapon aside.
Too bad. Splendidly destructive device.
He closely examined her wounded hand.
Not blood.
Belby shook her head.
Interesting.
Krovax sniffed the glistening oil and, without warning, licked the thin black liquid oozing from the wound. Belby strained against the statue's grip. The one holding her wounded hand softened its hold just for a second. It was enough. Belby's open palm connected with Krovax's cheek and sent him sprawling. Nasser and some of his men started toward him. Krovax got to his knees and stopped them with a blood-chilling glare.
No one moves!
He hissed. Why not release me and make it a fair fight? Belby taunted, waving her free hand. Krovax caught her hand in his, and they wrestled for a few seconds.
Why do you imagine combat has to be fair?
He gasped. He backhanded her across the face twice. Belby's eyes filmed with gray until she shut out that pain as well. Krovax was plainly surprised when she took his blows and grimly smiled at him. You are the strongest, Belby said. There's no point resisting the inevitable. I will name you Evankar. All fell silent. Urtai chewed through his gag and spat out the wad of clothing, croaking, Belby, no!
You heard her!
Krovax cried, pointing a finger at the assembled sergeants.
She said it! I said it, and I mean it, Belby said. But it's not official until I proclaim you governor before the overlords on Phyrexia. How can you do that? Do I have to travel to Phyrexia?
No! I must declare you Evankar before the open window. She meant the voice-only message portal in the convocation hall. Krovax stood back. The statues released Belby and Urtai.
I give you this much grace. You are the emissary and redoubtable fighter,
He said.
Summon the court to the window and proclaim me Evankar to everyone.
Belby rubbed her battered hand. I will. Tomorrow.
Why not now?
It's late, she said. We can do this in haste, or we can install you with all the grave and proper ceremony. It's up to you. There's also the matter of Eladamri.
What's he got to do with this?
Wouldn't you like to have him at your feet in chains when I name you to the throne? Everything in the hall will be seen on Phyrexia, you know. Wouldn't you like to impress the overlords by presenting them with a defeated leader of the rebels? She saw the glimmer of vanity in his eyes. Krovax nodded with satisfaction.
I still don't see why we can't do it sooner,
He said. Give Grevin the night to break him, Belby said coolly. You wouldn't have him shout rebel slogans while the overlords are watching, would you?
Hardly.
Krovax smiled.
You're much too clever for someone whose life is measured in weeks. Why don't you remain on Rath? When I am Evankar, we'll need clever servants to carry out my will.
She didn't say anything. She cradled her injured hand in her good one and regarded it thoughtfully.
The idea intrigues you?
Said Krovax. It's an interesting proposal. I shall consider it. The sergeants picked up their dead comrade and the injured men hobbled away to the dispensary. 4 of them, including Nasser, remained behind, surrounding Urtai.
I'll keep the light of your life until tomorrow.
Krovax said.
His life is my guarantee. You'll not renege on your promise.
You will be Evankar, Belby said. You have my word as emissary of the overlords. Let Urtai go. Krovax laughed.
Shall we say tomorrow? An hour past midday? I'd hate to become governor until after the courtiers have been fed.
Choose the hour you want. I will be there. Krovax herded Urtai and the sergeants out. He paused by the door.
I'll have to do something about this clutter.
He said.
My predecessor had appalling taste. Such a weakness for the uniform. Good night, Excellency. I enjoy the fight.
She picked up the cast-off Phyrexian discharger. The jewels on the top were dark. Belby turned the weapon over and discovered the power stone was gone. Someone, presumably Krovax, removed it during the melee. An impressive feat, considering he'd never handled such a device before. He'd also removed the Power Stone without the special tool, barehanded. An ordinary man would have been struck dead by the potent energy stored in the stone.